Our theme for this month is deep listening. When I began thinking about this service and investigating the topic, I came to realize two things very quickly. The first was that various cultural and religious traditions going back far into human history have stressed the importance of listening. For example, Aboriginal writer Miriam Rose Montgomery Bauman says that in our Aboriginal way, we learn to listen from our earliest days. We could not live good and useful lives unless we listened. We learned by watching and listening, waiting and then acting. Greek philosopher Plutarch from the 2nd century AD wrote that if young men have not the power to listen or the habit of getting some profit through listening, the speech brought forth by them is windy indeed. An interesting way of putting it, but there is some truth here. My second realization was that developing this skill is not easy. It requires commitment and constant attention. The challenge is that there is so much more involved than simply hearing the words spoken by others. One needs to pay attention to body language and how the words are spoken, rather than just the words themselves, and to the feelings expressed by the speaker. One needs to avoid making judgments, to maintain one's focus, and to listen with an empathetic ear. This is hard work, and there are many pitfalls, and I certainly have not been immune to those pitfalls, both in my personal life and in my professional life. How often have I begun to formulate my response before the speaker has even concluded his or her comments? Way too many times to remember. How often have I found myself listening very attentively if the conversation impacts me directly, but allowing my attention to drift if the focus is more about the needs of the other person? Embarrassingly guilty here as well. And how often do I cut off the conversation early because my brain has already moved on to the next thing on my to-do list? I've lost count on that one. These examples may resonate with you, or you may be able to think of other examples when your deep listening skills have been challenged. So how should we view this idea of deep listening as Unitarian Universalist? The case could be made that it is a component of a number of our 7 principles. But for me, it is most critical and most connected to our first principle. We covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. In order to achieve this, we must have the ability and the willingness to listen deeply. So come, let us worship together as we commit to the practice of deep listening within, among, and beyond in the wider world.
We float on a sea, hidden beneath dry surfaces covered by stones. Isn't this why we drink and dive so deeply, go down to the sea in ships, risk drowning again and again? Isn't this why Moses parted the waters to begin his journey? Why Jesus crossed the waters to comfort and challenge us? We were born in water. We float free in water. We are washed clean by water. Isn't this why we long to find our inward sea to help us wash clean the world? When I was pursuing my Master of Divinity degree at Chicago Theological Seminary, I took several courses on the topic of theology. Now, theology is a word that most likely either has a lot of meaning in your life, perhaps even negative meaning from past experiences, or it may be a term that you don't often think about. While theology translates most literally to the study of the nature of God, in truth and in practice, today, Theology more broadly refers to the study of religion itself and religious belief writ large. And as far as I'm concerned, I use the word theology and philosophy pretty interchangeably. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah. So when I was in seminary, I took several courses on theology, most notably 2 classes that bookended my degree. The first class was called Systematic Theology, and the capstone class was called Constructive Theology. Whereas theology might be more of a foreign or complex topic to some of us, the adjectives systematic and constructive are easier for one to connect with, perhaps. In systematic theology, I learned how to systematically think about how religious beliefs are formed and categorized. And in constructive theology, I learned how to, yes, you guessed it, how to construct my own theological worldview, one that would guide my beliefs and actions as I moved through this life. So where am I going with this? So in both of these courses, I learned about many theological traditions and about approaches to these theologies and about the theologians who developed and popularized them. One of the traditions that spoke most to me during seminary and remains very influential to this day is called metaphorical theology. Now, metaphorical theology is a school of thought developed by the late feminist theologian Sallie McFague, who actually died this past November. One of the key characteristics of this theological approach is the emphasis on metaphor for describing God, or the divine, of mystery, wonder, and all that is sacred. The use of metaphor, and by extension the use of poetry and creative writing, have influenced generations of religious leaders, including me, as I've mentioned before. This is why I love the power of language and its ability to liberate us. Not to confine us, but to liberate us, and to create new worlds of compassion and justice for all people. Through metaphor, we can get closer to the full realization of love in this universe. I was reminded of Sallie McFague this week as I reflected on the theme of deep listening. This is our overarching theme for the month. Last week, I focused on internal listening, on listening within, listening to one's own heartbeat, and the difficulty of this practice. And I promised that on this Sunday, today, we would turn to explore listening on the interpersonal and communal levels. So not so much listening within, but listening beyond ourselves, whether in a family, congregation, society, or world. Needless to say, this takes on even more difficulty when we consider the political and social division we are facing in 2020. Where will we find answers to this practical question of deep listening beyond ourselves, especially when it is so difficult? Let's turn to Sallie McFague for some guidance. As we examine the metaphor and image of deep listening, we might begin to find meaning and direction to this longing we share. First, let's explore the theme itself. We are not focusing merely on listening, but on deep listening. I use that term a lot, I know. Deep. Deeper, deepen, depth. At UUCCI, we ask, how do we not merely listen, but listen more deeply? By using our imagination, I consider this to be an invitation to listen beneath the surface. Subsequently, when we talk about the surface and going beneath, going deeper, the image of water is what naturally comes to mind. Diving beneath the surface. Deep sea diving or fishing. The image jumping into the deep end of the pool, for example, or from when you were a kid, getting in deep trouble. Of course, the useful imagery of water elucidates the natural irony of being human and seeking to listen to that which is beyond ourselves. In other words, we can search for and discover deep truth when we listen for it beneath the surface. But, unfortunately, we can only breathe by remaining on the surface, on dry land, or on stable ground. Furthermore, the dilemma is heightened because we are searching not just to listen, but to know, to feel, to connect, and to arrive at truth and meaning, to arrive at love itself, a deep love that can be found and experienced in this lifetime. Thus, we are weighing on the one hand all those things, deep love, understanding, and connection, and on the other hand, our comfort and familiarity, our safety, not to mention our ability to breathe, air. And so I think it is a fitting image, an appropriate metaphor for this existential challenge we face as human beings in this world. Will we keep on breathing, or will we dive deeper to discover something even more precious than oxygen? Before I offer 3 tools or 3 ways of thinking about listening beneath the surface, I want to remind us of another not unrelated instance where we have come to use the word deep as something we long for as a community. If you have not yet memorized our congregational ends, the 8 statements of where we are headed as a congregation, what we long to make real in our personal, communal, and social lives, then I will remind you what we have said is our very first end as a congregation. We have set our intentions, our ministry, our resources to, and I quote, open ourselves to deeper human connection. We have said that as individuals, as a congregation, and in the wider world, we open ourselves to deeper human connections. This is one of our commitments over the next 5 years that we want to make real, ever more real. And this is where I think metaphor matters, where it matters that we give meaning where meaning is due, substance where substance is due, where we choose images, metaphors wisely. I remember when this end was developed, and I think I've shared some of this story with some of you before, what feels like a lifetime ago, and Bud Herron, our now past president, immediate past president, Bud Herron said, what does that even mean? What does deeper human connection even mean? Well, as a congregation, we have been exploring what that means the past 18 months. And we will continue to explore it and embody it over the next few years. And I expect a lot longer than that. Perhaps deeper human connection and listening beneath the surface are more related than not. Perhaps one might say that a marker of an individual, congregation, or society's depth of human connection is defined in part by its capacity to listen. And not just listen, but to listen deeply, to listen beneath the surface. So these 3 tools I will offer for listening beneath the surface should not be thought of as merely something to help us listen more deeply, but as some means to discover greater connection in this life. May we open to receiving these tools for deep listening. The first tool for listening beneath the surface is to remain still, like very still. It is hard to hear underwater. And it becomes even more difficult when we are thrashing around and making waves. We make it harder to hear or even see others beneath the surface. Additionally, we use a lot of energy when we are swimming beneath the surface. So the more still you make yourself, the longer you can remain in the deep. So consider stilling your heart and your mind to receive what is available to you down below. Second, once you have become very still, the second gift is to recognize that you are not alone, but held and surrounded by life itself. Literally, on each and every side of you, the waters of life and love are holding you, are pushing in against you in that space of adventure and vulnerability. Which leads us to the final tool. Beyond trying to remain calm and being held by all that is beneath the surface, the final tool is to lie face down, to float face down, not up, but to look down at what you have not yet experienced, rather than up to the surface. The purpose of looking down is that it will help you long for going deeper. It can help you let go of fear and reach for what is still possible, lower and lower, where the water is cooler and cooler. And I think you've noticed this, that when you lay face down, the water doesn't go up your nose as much. And that's really important. Look, these three tools will help you approach this metaphor for listening and finding connection in this life. They have helped me in my life, especially in these past several years, when the waters of life, when public and political discourse, when social unrest have felt like one constant riptide of danger. But instead of staying on shore, I have tried to stay in the water, to stay in relationship with people who it's not always easy to stay in relationship with, to try and open myself to deeper human connection, even when it's hard. Because even and especially when it's hard, that is the absolute right time when remaining at the surface will not suffice. There's a bumper sticker. When the surface does not suffice. Instead, depth is what we need now. Conversation, understanding, compassion, conviction, and confidence that we can go deeper and arrive at something precious. After the service today, I will be holding a special Third Sunday Forum, which will be sort of like a conversation with the minister, an opportunity to dive more deeply into the themes of this service. It can be a time for asking questions of me and have that sort of long ago, wonderfully loved congregational response time that I know many of you enjoy. So I hope you will join me for this time when we can explore further the topics of this service and really anything that might be on your mind. Steve introduced some of them, the different elements of the service, brought out new areas of this broad theme of deep listening. But I hope you will join me for that time. Together, my friends, we are a people of depth. We are people of depth, not superficiality. We long to dive, not to remain bone dry on this earth. We long for connection and wholeness, and to be a part of the great turning of this earth back toward the love we know we all were birthed from, and dare we hope will return one day. My friends, may we submerge together, and when we reemerge, may we be together still. May it be so, and amen.